How medieval fishermen measured rivers with ropes. When you imagine medieval life, your mind likely turns to castles, knights, and monasteries. But the rhythm of daily life was rarely shaped by banners or battles. For many, survival depended on something much quieter. Rivers. These waterways were not just natural boundaries, they were highways of commerce, sources of food, and sometimes even the difference between famine and plenty. To manage them, people needed practical knowledge. One forgotten practice, still faintly traceable in records, was how fishermen and ferrymen measured rivers with ropes. Picture a fisherman standing at the bank of a muddy river in 13th century Europe. He has no clock, no calculator, and no surveying equipment. What he has is a length of rope, often hemp, sometimes knotted at regular intervals. The rope might have been a simple household item, used for tying bundles or mooring a small boat. Yet, in his hands, it became a measuring device. The technique was not glamorous, but it served an essential purpose. Measuring rivers was not about curiosity, but about safety, planning, and taxes. Floods were a recurring danger in the Middle Ages. Rivers like the Rhine, the Loire, and the Thames regularly swelled their banks. Fishermen, ferrymen, and local officials needed ways to anticipate how wide or deep a river was at a given time of year. Rope gave them a method both simple and repeatable. A rope with evenly spaced knots could be thrown into the water to gauge width or lowered from a bridge or boat to test depth. The results were shared in oral terms, such as 4 ropes deep or 2 ropes across. To understand why this mattered, you need to place yourself in their world. Bridges were rare and often controlled by lords who charged tolls. Crossing a river meant relying on ferries or temporary wooden platforms. The danger of misjudging depth or current was very real. A farmer bringing grain to market could lose not just his cargo, but his life if he trusted the wrong crossing. Rope measurements became a local knowledge system, passed from one generation to the next. We do not have medieval instruction manuals for rope measuring, but hints appear in monastic records and civic accounts. Monks at monasteries near rivers often noted the state of the waters, sometimes recording how far they had risen against walls or piers. Civic councils in cities like Cologne or Ghent ordered officials to monitor water levels. These reports mattered for deciding when to levy special taxes for flood repairs. In that context, ropes were not just fishermen's tools, they were instruments of civic record. Hemp was the favored material for ropes in medieval Europe. Strong and water-resistant, it was cultivated widely. Rope makers, called rope makers or cordwainers, twisted fibers into strands and strands into cords. A well-made rope could last years, even with exposure to damp air. In fishing villages, ropes served many purposes: securing nets, anchoring boats, drying fish, and measuring rivers. It is telling that in inventories from towns along the North Sea, rope is listed almost as frequently as timber and iron tools. One of the most practical uses of rope measurement was seasonal fishing planning. Fish species migrated, and fishermen knew that their behavior changed with water depth and flow. Eels, for example, favored certain depths during spawning runs. Knowing whether a river was 3 knots deep could guide when to set traps or cast nets. Ropes helped ordinary people adapt to seasonal cycles, ensuring that their catch was not wasted. Beyond fishing, river measurement mattered for trade. Imagine merchants transporting barrels of wine along the Loire. Barges required a minimum depth of water to pass. Too shallow, and they risked grounding. Too deep and swift, and they risked overturning. Ropes gave crews a crude but effective way to test their route. This information was shared among bargemen, often orally, forming a kind of folk hydrography. Long before state hydrographic surveys, ropes told people what they needed to know. There were also legal dimensions. In medieval England, river tolls were sometimes based on the size of a craft. Ferrymen had to demonstrate whether a crossing was safe at a given time or risk disputes. Ropes provided evidence. If a rope showed that the current was beyond a safe depth, a ferryman could refuse passage without blame. If he allowed passage and an accident occurred, local courts might review whether he had made a reasonable judgment. Measurement was not just physical, it was social. When you look deeper into the logic of ropes, You see a medieval mindset that valued repeatable, tangible signs over abstract numbers. For them, measurement was about physical markers. A knot in a rope was something you could feel in your hand. A rope length was something your body could stretch across. These markers carried authority in communities where literacy was limited. If someone asked how deep the river ran, the answer came not in feet or meters, but in knots of a rope. As centuries passed, some of these practices became formalized. Early modern river engineers began developing more sophisticated measuring poles, chains, and graduated rods. But the rope method never disappeared entirely. In rural Europe, ferrymen still used knotted ropes into the 18th century. In Asia and Africa, similar practices developed independently using cords, reeds, or weighted strings. All pointed to the same need: ordinary people confronting unpredictable rivers with the simplest tools available. Consider how long it must have taken to memorize these patterns. A fisherman's son would learn the rope not as a device, but as part of the family's heritage. He might be told, "When the rope sinks to the third knot, don't cast here. The current will drag your net." Knowledge was carried in sentences, gestures, and the feel of wet rope slipping through the hands. The practice may seem boring today, but in its own time it was a lifeline. Measuring rivers with ropes was not about curiosity, but about survival, trade, and responsibility. Each knot carried meaning, and each throw of the rope was a test against nature. And yet, one cannot help but wonder, if ropes were so central to medieval river life, what other everyday practices have slipped from memory, buried under the grander tales of kings and knights? You have now stood on the riverbank and seen how a knotted rope became a tool of survival. But what happened once this simple device moved beyond the hands of fishermen and into the routines of villages and towns? The rope, it turned out, became more than a fisherman's companion. It became part of local governance, tax systems, and even disputes between neighbors. In many medieval communities, rivers served as borders. A single rope could help settle whether a boat belonged on one side or the other. Documents from French towns show that officials sometimes relied on rope measurements when adjudicating fines for illegal fishing. If a villager set his nets too close to another's grounds, the distance could be tested with a rope. A measurement might prove whether someone trespassed by a few knots or not at all. What to us seems like tedious detail was, in their world, the difference between profit and penalty. Taxes too crept into the picture. Local authorities often demanded tolls on fish catches or transport along rivers. These tolls were not based only on the number of barrels or baskets, but sometimes on the measured space occupied on a riverbank. A rope stretched out to mark rental plots for drying nets or storing boats. Imagine a fisherman paying for 2 ropes' worth of bank space, knowing that the knots defined the cost. The dull act of stretching hemp along muddy ground became an official act, witnessed by clerks, who copied it into parchment records. The reliability of rope made it attractive for construction as well. When bridges were planned, builders needed to know the breadth of the river. Ropes provided early estimates. They were not exact, but they gave enough to decide how many piles to drive, how many beams to cut. Chroniclers rarely wrote down the dull beginnings of bridge projects. Yet every stone arch began with someone throwing or stretching a rope. The same applied to mills, where measuring water depth determined whether a wheel would turn steadily or falter. Ropes also traveled with ferrymen. Ferries were lifelines connecting markets, farms, and parishes. A ferryman often kept a rope tied to the landing, both to secure the craft and to test the water each morning. A ritual might unfold. Dip the rope, count the knots, call out the depth. Passengers trusted this process. They may not have understood the numbers, but they understood the rope's verdict. Safe passage or no passage depended on this quiet routine. Records from the Low Countries show that ropes helped track floods as well. Civic leaders posted men to measure how far water had risen on floodplains. Their reports were not in abstract measurements, but in rope lengths. The water has risen 5 ropes since the last tolling of the bell, one might hear. Such data informed when to evacuate herds, when to reinforce levees, or when to declare emergencies. What feels like boring bookkeeping kept whole communities alive. These practices carried over into ritual as well. In some regions, ropes were part of religious observances tied to rivers. Priests and monks blessed waters during feast days, lowering ropes with weights to show God's dominion over creation. Pilgrims may have seen monks standing by bridges, solemnly dipping cords, counting knots, then chanting prayers. Even here, the rope was more than a tool. It was a link between human and divine order, practical and sacred at once. The persistence of rope in so many domains shows how medieval people built their world on tangible, repeatable signs. They had no need for precision to the centimeter. A knot or two told them enough. And yet, the system's vagueness led to disagreements. Was a rope stretched taut or slack? Was it measured dry or wet when hemp expanded? These questions sound trivial, but they mattered in lawsuits. Court records mention disputes where each side insisted on a different interpretation of the rope. A merchant might claim a crossing was 2 ropes across, while a ferryman swore it was 3. The court had to decide which rope and which hands were to be trusted. The practice also reveals something about medieval attitudes toward nature. Rivers were not tamed, not yet bound by canals or dams. They were shifting and alive. Ropes did not conquer them, but acknowledged them. Each knot was a compromise, a way of saying, we cannot control this river, but we can mark its changes. This mindset differed from later centuries, when engineers sought to dominate rivers with straight channels and locks. For the medieval fishermen, measurement was not control but accommodation. Over time, rope knowledge became layered with experience. Fathers taught sons not only how to tie knots, but how to interpret them in context. A rope might show a certain depth, but the color of the water or the sound of its flow told more. Ropes were only part of a larger sensory system. Smells, sounds, and sights combined with knots to form a lived hydrography. In this way, ropes were not separate instruments but extensions of human bodies and memory. The story of ropes is therefore not just about objects, but about communities shaping their relationship with rivers. Every knot tied and every measurement taken was part of a larger rhythm of survival. And yet, as ropes wove themselves into legal codes, trade customs, and religious rituals, one question lingers. How much did people truly trust them, and when did they prefer to rely on other senses instead? Now you can see how ropes guided fishermen, ferrymen, tax collectors, and priests. But how did this practice evolve, and what did it leave behind in the long run? The simple act of throwing a rope into water seems fragile compared to the instruments that followed. Yet for centuries, ropes shaped how people interacted with rivers, and traces of this habit remained even after more precise methods emerged. By the late medieval and early modern periods, rulers wanted more accurate data. Expanding trade networks, larger ships, and ambitious engineering projects demanded precision. Wooden sounding rods appeared, marked with carved notches. Chains weighted with lead replaced hemp cords on some barges. Yet in villages, ropes persisted. They were cheap, familiar, and easy to repair. A rope could be mended with a new splice or knot, while metal chains required specialists. For ordinary people, ropes remained practical tools well into the 17th century. Archaeological evidence gives faint confirmation. At river crossings in Central Europe, weights with rope fragments have been found, suggesting their use as sounding devices. Written records from English port towns in the 1500s describe sounding lines made of rope, knotted for depth. The transition was gradual, not abrupt. Even as rulers demanded surveys, locals still tied knots, trusting the methods their fathers taught. The decline of rope measurement tells us something about how societies change. As literacy spread, as states expanded, numbers began to matter more. Written ledgers demanded figures, not just descriptions like 3 knots deep. Surveyors trained in geometry began to displace ferrymen's judgments. Where once a villager's rope was trusted in court, now an official's written measure carried more weight. Precision replaced familiarity. Yet the old methods lingered, a quiet reminder of how communities once lived without clocks or compasses. Even in their decline, ropes influenced the development of measurement culture. Early nautical charts often marked depths using rope-based sounding lines. These charts used terms like fathoms, which were themselves derived from the span of outstretched human arms, a reminder that measurement remained tied to the body. Ropes, with their knots and spans, connected the physical to the numerical. They bridged the gap between feeling and counting. What may seem most striking today is not the ropes themselves, but the patience they required. Imagine lowering a rope from a boat into a river at dawn. You feel the waters pull. You wait for the knot to brush the bottom. You lift it again, wet and heavy, and read the result. There is no hurry. The pace matches the flow of the river itself. This slowness suited medieval life, where days were measured by bells and seasons, not minutes and seconds. In this way, ropes mirrored the rhythm of their world. The practice also left a cultural mark. Proverbs in some European regions refer to knots of a rope as symbols of certainty, while others mock them as unreliable. Old fishing songs sometimes mention ropes, weaving them into memory. These fragments remind us that measurement was not just technical but social. Ropes were part of language, imagination, and identity. As modern engineers built locks, canals, and dams, the rope receded from daily use. By the 19th century, it was more often associated with ships at sea than with ferrymen at rivers. Yet its legacy survived in small practices. Children measuring play spaces by pacing out ropes, farmers tying ropes across fields to mark boundaries, villagers using cords to divide water rights. The principle of knots as markers of space never truly vanished. When you think about medieval ropes, you realize they embody a larger truth about history. Great events, wars, treaties, dynasties, capture attention, but the slow work of ordinary people gave life its continuity. A rope thrown into a river may not seem as important as a king's decree, yet for the fisherman deciding where to cast his nets, it was far more vital. And so the story ends not with a grand event, but with reflection. The ropes of medieval rivers remind you that survival often depended on small, repetitive acts. Knots tied in hemp carried more weight for daily life than royal proclamations. As you drift to sleep, you might wonder, what simple tools today, taken for granted, will one day be seen as the ropes of our own age, fading into obscurity but once essential for survival? The daily grind of a Roman tax collector nobody remembers. When you think of the Roman Empire, images of emperors, senators, and gladiators tend to dominate. But the empire was not held together by Caesars or generals alone. It was held together by clerks, accountants, and tax collectors, whose daily routines kept coins flowing into the imperial treasury. Among them were men known as publicani in the Republic and later exactories under the Empire. They rarely appear in heroic stories, yet without them, aqueducts would not have been built, soldiers would not have been paid, and Rome's famous bread distributions would have ceased. Their lives were boring, methodical, and deeply resented by nearly everyone around them. Imagine a tax collector waking at dawn in a provincial town somewhere along the Roman frontier. Perhaps it is Gaul or Judea or North Africa. His job was not to wield a sword, but to sit at a wooden table in a public forum or roadside station, recording numbers and demanding payments. The system varied across the empire, but most taxes fell into categories: land taxes, poll taxes, customs duties, and market tolls. Collectors might also oversee fees for using bridges or transporting goods. Every transaction had to be written down, usually on wax tablets, later copied onto papyrus rolls or parchment. For locals, this man represented Rome itself. Farmers who had spent months tending barley or olives brought their produce in baskets or jars. Craftsmen brought finished goods. Traders brought coin, but few did so willingly. Complaints about taxes fill ancient texts. Cicero described the greed of publicani. Jewish writings denounce tax collectors as collaborators. Christian gospels list them alongside sinners. And yet, they remained essential. The collector's tools were unimpressive but vital. A stylus, wax tablets, cords for sealing baskets, scales for weighing grain, and often guards to enforce order. Records had to be meticulous. If a farmer claimed he owed less, the collector would check rolls from the previous year. If goods were unsealed, guards might accuse someone of hiding part of a shipment. The collector himself was often caught in the middle, balancing demands from superiors against hostility from locals. The work was repetitive. Farmers lined up to have their goods inspected. Traders presented coins, often worn or clipped, and disputes arose over whether they were acceptable. Toll collectors counted carts and animals at bridges. Customs officers checked amphorae for imported oil or wine. Every item needed to be marked, recorded, and sometimes stamped with lead seals to prove tax was paid. At the end of each day, numbers had to be reconciled. A tax collector might sit by lamplight, scratching figures into wax, while assistants checked lists. Mistakes could mean punishment, for Rome's governors expected accurate returns. Some collectors advanced money to the state in expectation of repayment through taxes, leaving them at personal risk. If harvests failed or trade slowed, they could fall into debt themselves. Thus, the job was not only boring but dangerous. You might wonder about their living conditions. A provincial tax collector was not rich by Roman standards, but he often lived more comfortably than farmers. He had steady income and sometimes skimmed profits. He wore modest but respectable clothing, often a tunic dyed darker to signal authority. His home was a small but well-furnished domus, with writing implements, accounts, and sometimes guards quartered nearby. While farmers rose with the sun to plow, he rose to sit at a table and listen to complaints. His world was measured not by seasons but by ledgers. Despite the hostility, collectors were necessary intermediaries. They connected villages to governors, governors to the emperor, and the emperor to the treasury. Without their dull persistence, Rome could not fund roads, aqueducts, or legions. Their unglamorous task created the infrastructure that emperors took credit for. When you walk through ruins of Roman cities today, you see stone and marble. Behind them, though, stood men with ropes, scales, and wax tablets, carefully recording the flow of goods. And yet, for all their importance, they were never admired. Satirists mocked them, locals cursed them, philosophers ignored them. The empire's historians wrote about wars and emperors, not about the man tallying amphorae at a dock. Their invisibility is perhaps the clearest sign of how boring their work was. They were essential but unloved. So you might ask yourself, what kept these men loyal? Why endure suspicion and resentment for a job that paid modestly and demanded so much? Was it ambition, necessity, or the quiet pride of knowing that without their ledgers, the empire's machinery would halt? Now that you have seen the daily tasks of a Roman tax collector, let us move deeper into the system that shaped his life. His work was not random. It was bound by rules, hierarchies, and the expectations of Rome. To understand him fully, you must see how taxation fit into the empire's machinery. Taxes were Rome's lifeblood. Landowners paid a portion of their crops, shepherds gave livestock, and merchants handed over duties on goods. Provinces varied in what they owed, but every region had to contribute. The collector stood at the bottom of this structure, but above him were layers of bureaucracy. Governors demanded returns to fund military garrisons. The imperial treasury in Rome expected deliveries of coin and grain. Each level pushed responsibility downward, so the man at the table carried pressure from all sides. Corruption was common. Some collectors demanded more than was required. Others skimmed profits by altering records. Ancient writers often condemned them for greed. Yet the truth was complicated. Collectors themselves faced quotas. If they failed to deliver enough, they could be fined or dismissed. In some cases, they bought the right to collect taxes in advance, a practice that forced them to recoup their investment by pressing locals harder. What seems like cruelty may have been desperation. The mechanics of collection were slow and tedious. Farmers queued with carts of wheat. Each load had to be inspected. Collectors weighed grain, marked amphorae, or sealed jars. Assistants copied figures onto wax tablets. Sometimes disputes erupted. A farmer might insist that his field had yielded less because of drought. A collector might refuse his excuse, citing the governor's orders. Tempers flared. Guards intervened. The record moved forward. Each quarrel delayed the line, stretching into long afternoons where the collector sat under the sun, listening to complaints. Religion occasionally heightened the tension. In Judea, tax collectors were symbols of Roman occupation. Local resentment was not only about money but about loyalty. Paying Rome meant acknowledging its rule. To locals, the collector was a collaborator, not just a bureaucrat. In other provinces, resentment was quieter but no less sharp. To be asked for tolls at bridges or gates was to be reminded that Rome controlled even the act of crossing a river. Yet, the collector himself was a provincial more often than not. Rome did not send thousands of Italians to staff its frontiers. It recruited locals, sometimes even from the same villages they taxed. This made their lives lonelier. They stood apart from neighbors, distrusted by communities that saw them as Rome's agents. A collector might live near people he grew up with, yet find himself shunned at the market. His children might be whispered about. His household depended on a job that earned both stability and scorn. Beyond money, taxes collected in kind, grain, oil, animals, had to be transported. Collectors organized carts, barges, or storage facilities. Grain warehouses were common features in Roman towns, guarded and locked. The collector had to ensure that the goods were tallied, stored, and delivered. Spoilage, theft, or delay could fall on his shoulders. He spent not only his days counting but also worrying about the security of what he had already collected. By evening, accounts had to balance. Assistants compared tallies from different checkpoints. Did the bridge tolls match the goods received? Were weights consistent? Was coin clipped or counterfeit? Rome demanded order. The collector, already weary from arguments, sat in lamplight, scratching figures, sealing tablets, and preparing reports for superiors. The monotony was relentless, and yet, for all the tedium, the system worked. Rome held provinces for centuries, not only by force but by maintaining a steady flow of resources. Legions marched because men like this collector counted grain. Aqueducts stood because revenues flowed. Boring as it was, his work fed the empire. But here is the unresolved thought. How much resentment could Rome absorb before this quiet system strained too far? Could the empire endure when the men who kept its ledgers were hated by those they taxed? The Roman tax collector's routine now seems clear. Sit, record, argue, balance accounts. But what of the larger picture? What did this job mean for the empire, and how did it shape the lives of those who bore its weight? To finish the story, you must see not only his daily grind but the consequences of his work. Taxes fed the Roman army. Grain collected in Egypt filled granaries that supplied legions along the Rhine. Silver mined in Spain, counted and taxed, paid soldiers in distant provinces. Without this steady flow, frontiers would collapse. The collector, sitting at his table, indirectly determined whether Rome's army stood or starved. He may never have seen a battlefield, but his figures reached it. Taxes also shaped cities. Aqueducts, amphitheaters, and baths were funded by revenues that began with farmers handing over barley or herdsmen surrendering sheep. Each stone in a Roman forum was tied to countless dull exchanges at tax stations. The collector himself might never step into the Colosseum, but his ledgers supported its construction. In this sense, he was both invisible and essential. Yet resentment simmered constantly. In Judea, tax demands fueled rebellion. In Gaul, tax burdens drove rural unrest. Even in Italy, smallholders cursed the system. Collectors became the face of empire, absorbing anger that might otherwise have been directed at distant governors. They endured hostility not because they wielded power, but because they represented it. Their presence reminded every villager of Rome's reach. Some sought small advantages within this role. A collector might ease the burden for a friend, or demand bribes from strangers. Others remained rigid, determined to follow orders precisely. Both types left marks in records, where discrepancies or complaints appear. We cannot always tell whether a collector was corrupt or cautious. What survives are dry figures, preserved on papyrus, stone inscriptions, or wooden tablets. Their handwriting outlasted their lives. The collector's legacy was one of anonymity. Few names remain. Unlike emperors or generals, their identities vanished into archives. What persists is the system they upheld, a web of obligations that tied provinces together. Their boredom preserved the empire's order. Their work, despised yet necessary, ensured that Rome endured for centuries. When you think of them, picture the silence of an office lit by a single lamp. Picture a man scratching numbers, listening to the murmur of guards, the shuffle of farmers outside. He was neither hero nor villain, but a figure caught between power and poverty, stability and scorn. His contribution was not dramatic, but without him, Rome's glory would have crumbled. And as you close this story, reflect on the question it leaves behind. How many empires in history have relied not on generals or kings, but on the quiet persistence of nameless clerks, counting, sealing, and tallying until the system they serve outlasts them? Forgotten bakers of ancient Rome's grain dole. Bread was the backbone of Roman life. In cities swollen with people, grain mattered more than gold. Without steady bread, riots broke out, politics crumbled, and emperors lost favor. To keep order, Rome created a system known as the annona, the grain dole. Citizens in Rome and later in other cities received measured rations of grain or bread subsidized by the state. Behind this system were not emperors or generals but bakers, ordinary craftsmen whose routines kept the masses fed. Their names rarely appear in histories, yet without them, the streets of Rome would have been restless. Imagine yourself in a crowded district of Rome in the 1st century CE. The smell of fresh bread drifts from a bakery with a simple stone oven. Inside, a team of men works silently, rhythmically. They knead dough in wooden troughs, pound it with their fists, shape it into rounds, and slide it onto flat stones heated by wood fires. The work begins before dawn. By the time markets open, baskets of bread are ready. Customers come with tokens from the state, stamped pieces of clay or lead that entitle them to loaves from the dole. The baker accepts these tokens, records the exchange, and adds them to a pile to be counted later. Bakers were organized into guilds called collegia pastorum. These groups ensured that production was steady, that quality met the city's standards, and that bread reached those entitled to it. Membership carried both privilege and burden. Bakers enjoyed protection of their trade but also heavy obligations. Some were compelled by law to remain in the profession, for emperors understood how dangerous it was to let the supply of bread falter. What might sound like a simple craft became, in effect, a public service. The physical work was exhausting. Grain arrived from provinces like Egypt, shipped across the Mediterranean, unloaded in Ostia, and carted into Rome. At mills, donkeys or slaves turned massive stones to grind it into flour. Bakers collected the flour, mixed it with water, kneaded it into dough, and baked it in clay or stone ovens. The heat was stifling, the hours long. A single bakery might produce thousands of loaves daily, enough to feed an entire neighborhood. These loaves were not soft or fluffy like modern bread. Roman bread was dense, dark, and often gritty with fragments of stone from grinding. Archaeological finds from Pompeii show carbonized loaves divided into sections like a pie, baked so they could be broken apart easily. For the poor, this bread was sometimes their only meal, eaten with water or cheap wine. The taste mattered less than the certainty of having it. For bakers, mistakes could be costly. Burning a batch or underproducing meant shortages. In times of scarcity, riots often began outside bakeries. Roman writers note how crowds gathered impatiently, shouting if deliveries ran late. The baker, sweating in his oven room, bore the brunt of this anger. He was not responsible for bad harvests in Egypt or storms at sea, but he was the visible face of shortage. In this way, his daily routine became political whether he wanted it or not. Beyond feeding the masses, bakeries were community hubs. Neighbors met at dawn to collect their loaves, gossip, and exchange news. Children ran errands with baskets. Officials sometimes checked weights to prevent fraud. The baker's shop was both workplace and stage, a place where the empire's promises of stability became visible. When emperors proclaimed panem et circenses, bread and circuses, they relied on men like this to deliver the bread half of the bargain. Still, life for bakers was not glamorous. They endured heat, flour dust, and endless repetition. They rarely grew rich, though some prospered enough to leave inscriptions thanking guilds or deities. More often, they remained anonymous. Excavations at Pompeii reveal bakeries frozen in time, with mills, troughs, and ovens still intact. They show the grind of daily labor, not the glory of emperors. These forgotten shops remind us that history's stability rested on flour and fire as much as marble and bronze. As you listen, you might wonder, how did bakers themselves feel about their role? Did they take pride in feeding the city, or did they see themselves as trapped in endless labor demanded by the state? Their voices are missing from records, leaving only the quiet testimony of ovens and charred loaves. The world of Roman bakers was not only about mixing flour and water. It was part of a wider machine that stretched from Egyptian fields to Roman farms. Grain was shipped, taxed, stored, milled, and finally baked. The baker stood at the end of this chain, turning all the empire's logistics into loaves. His work was simple, but it connected him to distant provinces and to the restless crowds outside his shop. The process began long before dawn. Grain had been ground the night before at mills turned by donkeys or slaves. Some wealthier bakeries owned their own mills, while others purchased flour from millers. At the start of the day, bakers measured flour into wooden troughs, added water, and sometimes mixed in sourdough starter from a previous batch. Teams of workers pounded the dough with their fists and elbows, a slow, heavy labor. They then shaped rounds and scored them so they could be divided after baking. Firing ovens required equal effort. Fuel had to be hauled in, often wood or brush. In a city the size of Rome, with 1 million mouths to feed, demand for would strained resources. Bakers sometimes turned to cheaper fuels like chaff or reeds. Ovens were heated for hours, their stones absorbing heat until they glowed. When ready, bakers raked out ashes and slid dough inside with long paddles. Heat filled the room, sweat clung to the workers, and the cycle began again. The guild system imposed strict rules. Bakers could not abandon their work at will. By the late empire, the state tied families to the profession, ensuring a steady supply of bread. Sons of bakers often became bakers themselves. While other trades might allow movement or change, baking became a hereditary duty. This shows how vital bread was to Roman stability. To lose bakers was to risk hunger and unrest, so emperors bound them tightly to their ovens. Payment for bread depended on the dole system. Citizens entitled to free or subsidized bread presented tokens. These were exchanged for loaves, and bakers turned the tokens over to officials for reimbursement. Others bought bread outright, but the bulk of production went through the state system. Inscriptions from Rome mention officials inspecting bakeries to ensure fairness. Fraud, such as reducing loaf size or substituting inferior flour, was punished severely. In this way, the baker lived under constant watch, both from the state and from neighbors. The bread itself varied. Most common was coarse brown bread, heavy with bran. Wealthier Romans preferred white bread, sifted from finer flour. Bakers supplying elites sometimes produced elaborate loaves flavored with honey, cheese, or herbs. But the majority of citizens ate the rough, dense rounds preserved in Pompeii's ruins. These loaves were marked with stamps or scores, proving their place in the dole system. Each loaf was evidence of the state's promise fulfilled, at least for that day. The social role of bakers cannot be overstated. Crowds gathered at their shops daily. Gossip spread there as quickly as bread. Rumors of shortages often began outside ovens. If loaves were late, whispers of corruption or failure passed through the streets. Bakers became symbols of either stability or neglect. When riots broke out in Rome, they often began with hunger and moved quickly to bakeries and grain stores. The baker lived with the knowledge that he was only one shipment or storm away from being blamed for unrest. For the bakers themselves, the work was thankless. Heat and flour dust damaged their health. Ovens scarred their arms. Hours were long, with little chance of escape from the trade. Yet some took pride in their craft. Inscriptions found in Rome and Ostia honor guilds of bakers, showing processions with decorated bread. Statues of bakers' tools were carved into tombs. These traces reveal that, while their work was overlooked by elites, bakers found dignity in their labor and solidarity in their guilds. And still, one question lingers. How did they balance their duty to the state with their own survival? Was the pride of feeding a city enough to outweigh the exhaustion of endless heat and the fear of restless crowds? The story of Rome's bakers moves now toward its conclusion. You have seen their routines, their guilds, and their burdens. But what became of them, and what legacy did they leave behind in history? By the later centuries of the empire, the baker's role grew even more rigid. Laws from the 4th century CE tied bakers to their trade permanently. This was part of a wider pattern where professions considered essential to survival, like bakers, shipbuilders, and millers, were made hereditary. Sons of bakers could not leave the profession. In effect, families became bound to ovens for generations. What began as a craft evolved into an obligation to the state, and bakers carried that burden until the empire itself unraveled. At the same time, the system of the grain dole expanded. Bread became not just a food but a political promise. Emperors advertised their generosity through loaves. Inscriptions boasted of distributions. Coins depicted ears of grain. Statues honored the goddess Annona, embodiment of the food supply. Behind this imagery stood ordinary men, sweating in ovens, ensuring that each promise could be kept. Without them, the emperor's image as a provider would collapse. The archaeological record preserves haunting evidence of their work. In Pompeii, carbonized loaves survive, stamped with baker's seals. They show precise divisions, proof of regulation. In Ostia, bakeries with mills and ovens remain, their worn stones testifying to endless labor. These ruins, quiet and gray, reveal the grind of daily production better than any surviving text. The absence of names in history books contrasts with the permanence of their ovens. Their silence speaks of forgotten lives that once fed millions. In literature, bakers rarely appear. Poets wrote of feasts, generals, and banquets, but not of the men who produced the bread that sustained them. At most, satirists mocked cheap loaves or shortages. The gap between their importance and their invisibility is striking. Rome could not survive without bread, yet it did not celebrate bakers as heroes. Their dignity rested within their guilds, in small monuments, and in the satisfaction of daily necessity. Their story invites reflection. Civilizations often honor warriors and rulers, but survival rests equally on those who grind, knead, and bake. The baker's day was monotonous, yet without it, the empire's order would fracture. Riots were not caused by defeats in war but by empty stomachs in the forum. Bread, produced in silence, carried more power than a senator's speech. As you close this chapter, consider what their lives mean for us today. How many professions now seem ordinary, boring, or thankless, yet keep societies functioning? Nurses, clerks, sanitation workers, all face the same invisibility. The Roman baker's oven is long cold, but the lesson remains. Stability often depends on those whose names are never remembered. And so, as the smoke from Roman ovens drifts into memory, you are left with a thought. When future generations look back at our time, whose work will they see as the bakers of our age, forgotten yet indispensable? The endless notes of Ottoman palace accountants. When you think of an imperial palace, you may imagine silk-robed sultans, jeweled thrones, or the echo of music in marble halls. Yet the Ottoman palace was also filled with paper, ink, and numbers. Behind the ceremonies and intrigues were accountants, scribes who spent their lives copying, calculating, and recording every coin that moved through the empire. Their world was not glamorous. It was desks, ledgers, and endless notes written in careful Ottoman script. Without their steady hands, the grandeur of top copy would have crumbled. Each day began early. Accountants reported to offices within the palace complex. Their tools were simple: reed pens, inkwells, paper or parchment, and bound registers. They sat at low desks or mats, surrounded by stacks of records. Some copied orders from higher officials. Others checked the flow of taxes arriving from distant provinces. Every transaction, whether it was a shipment of grain from Egypt, revenue from customs at Izmir, or payments to janissaries, had to be recorded. Accuracy was survival. Mistakes could bring suspicion, punishment, or dismissal. The empire's wealth flowed through their hands, but none of it was theirs. They worked as intermediaries, ensuring that the treasury balanced. Reports moved upward through layers of bureaucracy, from provincial scribes to palace accountants, and then to the chief treasurer. Their writing formed the backbone of the Ottoman state. Even military campaigns depended on them. Armies marched only when pay was secured and supplies accounted for. The work was monotonous. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the scratching of pens. Pages filled with neat rows of numbers, names, and dates. A clerk might spend an entire morning calculating the difference between expected revenue and actual receipts from a province. Another might copy figures from one ledger to another, ensuring consistency. Over years, these acts created vast archives, shelves groaning with registers. Some still survive today, their ink faded but legible, testifying to centuries of patient labor. Accountants were not high officials, yet they were respected for their literacy and precision. Many came from educated backgrounds, trained in madrasas where they learned calligraphy, arithmetic, and law. Within the palace, they formed their own circles, often living modestly, devoted to their craft. Advancement was slow, dependent on loyalty and seniority. Few became wealthy, but they carried influence in quiet ways, for numbers shaped decisions as much as decrees. The stress of the role was real. The Sultan and his ministers demanded clarity. If grain shipments failed, if military pay was delayed, accountants could be blamed. Some faced audits, interrogations, or even harsher consequences. Their safety depended on the neatness of their handwriting and the correctness of their sums. Unlike soldiers, they did not risk death in battle. Yet their mistakes could ruin them just as surely. Still, the scribes endured. Their endurance came not from ambition, but from duty and habit. They knew their work was invisible yet indispensable. The empire's grandeur, the domes, the armies, the ships, rested on the columns of figures they recorded. In their silence, they held the empire together. And as you picture them bent over their ledgers, you may wonder, how did they endure the boredom of endless notes, day after day, year after year? Was it pride in their skill, fear of error, or the simple rhythm of repetition that kept them at their desks? The Ottoman accountants you met in the first section did not live in isolation. Their work connected them to farmers in Anatolia, merchants in Aleppo, governors in Cairo, and soldiers on the Hungarian frontier. To understand their lives, you must follow the flow of numbers they recorded and see how their endless notes shaped both palace order and provincial survival. Imagine the arrival of a courier at Topkapi Palace. He has ridden for weeks from Damascus with sealed reports. Dust covers his clothes, sweat stains his tunic. The packet he delivers is opened not by the Sultan, but by accountants in the Treasury office. Inside are lists, taxes collected on silk caravans, duties from spice markets, revenues from villages. The numbers are precise, or at least they appear so. Each figure must be copied into a central register. An accountant dips his reed pen into ink, straightens his paper, and begins transcribing. One miswritten digit could cast suspicion on an entire province. The Ottoman financial system was vast. Provinces owed taxes in cash, grain, animals, or manufactured goods. Some payments went directly to support janissary garrisons. Others funded shipyards, mosque repairs, or irrigation works. Accountants in the palace acted as the empire's central nervous system. They balanced what provinces claimed to send with what actually arrived. When figures did not match, investigations followed. This meant that a bored clerk in Istanbul could set off inquiries that reached far into the provinces. Day after day, accountants faced repetition. They opened reports, checked figures, copied them into ledgers, and filed them. But the monotony was broken by audits. Every so often, superiors ordered accounts to be reviewed. Clerks then reread months of entries, line by line, searching for errors. The atmosphere grew tense. Men whispered over tables, pointing at columns, debating whether a mistake was arithmetic or deliberate fraud. Punishments for corruption were harsh. Lower clerks might be dismissed, higher officials fined or imprisoned. Fear of these audits kept men's hands steady as they copied numbers hour after hour. The physical act of writing was itself a discipline. Ottoman calligraphy demanded beauty as well as clarity. Every figure had to be written with balance and precision. Accountants trained for years to master scripts like Divani, which allowed both elegance and compactness. To you, rows of neat Arabic numerals might look dry, but to them each line carried aesthetic weight. A poorly written ledger shamed the scribe as much as a mathematical error. Thus, accountants balanced art and arithmetic in every note. The rhythm of their work was shaped by seasons and politics. At harvest time, numbers swelled. Grain taxes poured into registers. In wartime, expenditures ballooned. Accountants worked late into the night, calculating pay for janissaries or tallying supplies for campaigns. Some described the Treasury office as a second battlefield. Soldiers fought with swords, clerks with pens. Both determined the outcome of wars. An army unpaid could mutiny. An army underfed could collapse. Quiet accountants in Istanbul held the fate of distant battlefields in their ledgers. Socially, accountants occupied a peculiar position. They were literate, respected for their skills, yet not glamorous. They lived modestly, often in quarters near the palace. Their lives revolved around ink, paper, and duty. Marriage ties linked them to other bureaucratic families. Advancement came slowly by seniority and loyalty. A few rose to become chief treasurer, but most remained mid-level clerks, copying until their eyesight dimmed and their hands stiffened. For them, prestige was not wealth but the recognition of accuracy. The weight of responsibility was heavy. Consider a shipyard in Galata needing funds for timber. If accountants delayed payments, work stalled, ships remained unfinished, and the empire's navy suffered. Or think of janissaries in Edirne demanding pay. If ledgers showed shortages, unrest could break out. Thus, accountants were constantly aware that errors in their quiet office could ripple outward into riots or military defeats. They bore invisible power, exercised not by orders but by arithmetic. Their archives grew immense. Ottoman registers filled entire rooms. Pages bound in leather, stacked on shelves, dust thick on their covers. Accountants navigated these piles daily, pulling out past entries to compare with current figures. Imagine the smell of ink and parchment, the creak of wooden shelves, the dim light filtering through palace windows. Hours passed as men bent over books, turning pages, marking corrections. Their world was not one of drama but of accumulation, detail upon detail, until ledgers themselves became monuments. And yet, boredom was their companion. Clerks sat in silence, their only breaks the call to prayer or the arrival of tea. Some must have longed for more exciting posts. Others perhaps found comfort in routine, pride in neatness. We cannot know their private feelings. What remains are the ledgers, mute testimony to years of disciplined repetition. The endurance of this system is striking. For centuries, through wars, rebellions, and dynastic changes, accountants kept writing. Sultans came and went, yet the ledgers continued. In this way, the empire's stability depended less on the charisma of rulers than on the persistence of scribes. Their notes, boring though they seemed, were the threads binding provinces to palace. And so the question rises: how did these men, surrounded by ink and numbers, find meaning in work that demanded everything yet promised so little recognition? Was it loyalty to empire, fear of error, or the quiet satisfaction of leaving behind perfect lines in fading ink? The accountants of the Ottoman palace carried their burden in silence. You have seen their routines and their responsibilities, but how did their story end? What legacy did these men, bent over ledgers, leave behind in the empire's history? And what can their endless notes tell us about the quiet foundations of power? The Ottoman treasury became, in many ways, the memory of the empire. Each page recorded taxes, payments, debts, and obligations. Generations of scribes copied and recopied these figures. Some registers tracked entire provinces over centuries. Today, historians working in archives in Istanbul still open these volumes, their ink dark though centuries old. What they find is not grand declarations, but lists of sheep, bushels of wheat, tolls on bridges, stipends for soldiers. These details seem small, yet together they mapped the empire's life more accurately than any chronicle. The accountants themselves remain shadows. Few names are known beyond the titles of chief treasurers. Ordinary clerks left no monuments. Their handwriting is their only surviving voice. The neat columns they copied out day after day are the closest thing to a biography. We cannot hear their complaints, their hopes, or their fears. We see only the precision they maintained for the sake of an empire that barely acknowledged them. Yet their influence was undeniable. Armies could not march without their figures. Palaces could not shine without their sums. Mosques could not be repaired without their approvals. An accountant in the palace, correcting a single number, could alter the flow of funds that determined whether a provincial project thrived or starved. Theirs was the power of invisibility, a power exercised through arithmetic rather than decree. Their lives also illustrate a truth about bureaucracy. Systems endure when individuals are replaceable, and Ottoman accountants were highly replaceable. When one retired, another trained in calligraphy and arithmetic took his seat. Continuity mattered more than personality. That is why the registers never stopped, even during crises. When sultans were dethroned, when janissaries rioted, the accountants kept writing. Their ledgers outlasted dynasties. What did their daily grind mean to them? Perhaps some took pride in the discipline of their script, the orderliness of their sums. Others may have felt trapped, bound to repetition without hope of advancement. We cannot know. What we can see is that the empire depended on them. Their boredom was Rome's bread in another form, an invisible necessity, overlooked but essential. The story of these accountants also reveals something about history itself. We celebrate sultans and viziers, but we overlook the clerks who made their grandeur possible. Without ledgers, wealth could not be managed. Without managed wealth, soldiers could not be paid. Without paid soldiers, palaces would fall. The ink of the accountants was as crucial as the steel of the janissaries. As you reflect on their lives, picture the endless rows of ledgers stacked in quiet chambers. Dust settles on them now, but once they were the pulse of empire. Each line represented hours of careful labor, each figure a fragment of survival. Their notes, boring to read, preserved the empire for centuries. And so the thought lingers. When you measure the strength of a state, should you look at its armies and rulers, or at the forgotten men in dim offices, writing numbers that outlast all glory? How Tang Dynasty salt caravans counted their loads. In the Tang Dynasty, salt was not just a seasoning. It was wealth, power, and survival. The Chinese state drew vast revenues from salt, regulating its production and transport with a precision that seems surprising for its age. Behind this great enterprise stood caravans, long trains of donkeys, mules, and camels hauling sacks of crystalline white across deserts and mountain passes. And behind the caravans stood a simple practice: counting. Loads had to be tallied, checked, and recorded. It was boring work, but it was the kind of boredom that kept an empire alive. Imagine the scene in the 8th century, somewhere on the road between Sichuan's salt wells and the great cities of the north. A caravan halts at a way station. Animals are tied to posts, drivers rest in the shade. At the center of the bustle, officials unseal the sacks of salt. Each must be weighed or counted. A tally stick is marked, or a register filled. Only when every load is confirmed can the caravan move on. The empire could not afford mistakes, for salt taxes filled the treasury more surely than tribute or plunder. Salt was so essential that it formed one of the earliest monopolies in Chinese history. The Tang government strictly controlled its production and transport. Licensed merchants were permitted to move salt from designated wells and marshes. In return, they paid heavy taxes. These revenues funded armies, palaces, and the civil service. For that system to work, caravans had to be counted with care. At each stage, from production to distribution, clerks checked the numbers. The dull act of counting prevented theft, fraud, or rebellion. How did they count? Records describe the use of tally sticks, ropes knotted at intervals, and written registers. Each load of salt might weigh a standard measure, but sacks tore, animals faltered, and merchants schemed. Counting was both physical and bureaucratic. A clerk might run his hand over each sack, mark a tally stick, then compare the marks with an earlier list. In some cases, tokens were exchanged at checkpoints, small pieces of wood or bamboo proving that a load had passed inspection. The system was repetitive, but it worked. For the caravan drivers, the process was tedious. They stood by while clerks poked at sacks, weighed them, and argued over discrepancies. Time dragged. Dust settled on their clothes. Animals shifted impatiently. Yet they had no choice but to endure. Without official stamps or tallies, they could not pass the next checkpoint. In this way, the empire turned counting into control. A driver might own his animals, but the state owned the salt. The human cost of this system was heavy. Caravans stretched for miles, trudging through deserts like the Gobi or climbing mountain passes in the west. Drivers rose before dawn, loaded animals, and walked all day. At night, they huddled by fires, guarding their cargo. The rhythm of their lives was not measured by weeks or months, but by tallies: how many loads had been delivered, how many remained to be carried. For them, counting was both a burden and a reassurance. A completed tally meant payment, food, and survival. Salt itself had many uses beyond the kitchen. Preserved fish, meat, and vegetables. It served in rituals and medicine. Families without salt risked illness, for it was one of the few reliable sources of dietary minerals. Its absence could spark unrest. The government understood this well. By controlling salt, it controlled not only revenue but also the health and stability of its people. And that control depended on the boring diligence of clerks and caravan drivers who counted sack after sack, year after year. The Tang system became a model for later dynasties. Each inherited the principle that salt was too valuable to be left to chance. Each developed ways to count, tax, and monitor its movement. In this sense, the story of a single caravan was part of a centuries-long continuity. What seems like dull repetition, marking tally sticks, weighing sacks, stamping permits, was in fact the foundation of China's fiscal strength. Think of the patience required. A caravan of 100 animals might carry several hundred sacks. Each sack had to be verified, each figure recorded. Clerks bent over registers, drivers shifted their feet, animals snorted in the dust. Hours passed in monotony, and yet, without those hours, the system would collapse. Fraud would spread, revenues would fall, and soldiers would go unpaid. The empire's grandeur rested on the backs of donkeys and the marks of tally sticks. So when you imagine the Tang dynasty's poets, painters, or generals, remember also the men with ink-stained fingers who counted salt loads at checkpoints. Their work was dull, but it mattered. For them, survival was not in verse or battle, but in repetition, in the endless rhythm of sacks, sticks, and sums. And yet, one question remains. In a world where salt meant survival, how much trust could the state place in the accuracy of those humble tallies scratched on wood or inked on paper? Salt caravans of the Tang dynasty were not only about moving sacks from one point to another. They were part of an entire network of regulation, inspection, and taxation that stretched across the empire. To continue their story, you must look beyond the dusty roads and see how these caravans were watched, managed, and sometimes resented. The boring but relentless process of counting became both a tool of governance and a cause of tension. Each caravan followed routes approved by the state. These routes connected salt wells in Sichuan, marshes along the coast, and desert sources in the west to markets in Chang'an, Luoyang, and other cities. At way stations, clerks waited with registers. The arrival of a caravan meant hours of inspection. Drivers unloaded part of their cargo, sacks were weighed or counted, and figures were written down. Once verified, clerks issued permits stamped with seals. Without those seals, no caravan could proceed. A sack of salt without papers was contraband, and its carrier faced harsh penalties. The system was designed to prevent smuggling, but smuggling thrived all the same. Salt was too valuable to leave to official channels alone. In many provinces, smugglers carried hidden loads along back roads, avoiding checkpoints. They bribed guards or disguised salt as other goods. Officials in the Tang court knew this, and their records often mention attempts to suppress illegal trade. Accountants compared the tallies of expected salt shipments with actual receipts, and discrepancies pointed to corruption or smuggling. Once again, the empire relied on counting, using the dull language of numbers to uncover hidden flows. For caravan drivers, this meant suspicion was constant. They endured endless inspections not only to verify their cargo but to prove their honesty. A missing sack, whether stolen, spoiled, or spilled, could bring accusations of fraud. Clerks questioned them, compared tallies, and sometimes imposed fines. Drivers bore the blame for shortages even when the fault lay with merchants or officials. Their lives were tied to the numbers on paper, numbers that did not bend to the hardships of travel. The hardships themselves were many. Salt sacks were heavy, sometimes weighing dozens of kilograms. Animals stumbled on rough paths, tore bags on sharp rocks, or collapsed from exhaustion. Drivers patched sacks with leather or cloth, tied them tighter with ropes, and pressed onward. At night, campsites echoed with the sound of animals breathing and drivers whispering as they checked loads by firelight. Each tally in the ledger represented days of sweat and vigilance. At the same time, counting extended to households. In many regions, families received salt in measured amounts, and their purchases were recorded. Officials set prices, and bakers, butchers, and market sellers all depended on steady supply. Too little salt and food spoiled. Too much control and resentment spread. Caravans thus bore the weight of social stability as well as economic order. Their numbers determined what families ate, how food was preserved, and even whether soldiers remained healthy on campaign. What makes the Tang salt system striking is not just its scope, but its dullness. It was not celebrated in poems or painted on scrolls. Instead, it lived in rows of characters in registers, in tally sticks carved with notches, in seals pressed into paper. And yet, it shaped the empire more surely than battles. The state's strength rested less on swords than on the boring persistence of clerks who counted salt loads day after day. Some clerks became specialists. They knew by sight the standard weight of a sack or the expected tally of a caravan. They developed instincts about fraud, sensing when merchants tried to conceal shortages. Their expertise was not glamorous, but it was valued. The empire trusted them more than it trusted generals, for without their vigilance, revenues would falter. But the same system also bred discontent. Merchants resented taxes that cut into their profits. Drivers resented inspections that delayed their journeys. Families resented high prices. Smugglers became folk heroes in some regions, celebrated for outwitting inspectors and providing cheaper salt. In this way, the boring act of counting became entangled with resistance. What was meant to ensure stability sometimes fueled unrest. And yet, the system endured. Why? Because salt was too important to ignore. The Tang rulers understood that without salt, the empire would weaken. They accepted the resentment, knowing that it was better to endure complaints than to face famine or rebellion. Caravans continued to move, clerks continued to count, and the treasury continued to fill. So the image lingers. Lines of animals trudging through dust, clerks bending over registers, drivers sweating as sacks are weighed. The process seems monotonous, but it held the empire together. And it raises a question. In a system built on endless counting, how much depended on trust? Could the empire really know if every sack was counted? Or did it rely on the honesty of men tired of numbers? The story of Tang Dynasty salt caravans now reaches its conclusion. You have seen how clerks counted loads, how caravans endured inspections, and how smugglers tested the system. What remains is to ask what all this counting achieved in the long run, and what legacy it left behind in history. The salt system of the Tang Dynasty was more than a method of raising revenue. It was a model of bureaucratic control. By taxing salt, the state tapped into a resource that everyone needed. Rich or poor, farmer or noble, no one could live without it. This made salt taxes both reliable and resented. For the Tang treasury, they were lifeblood. For ordinary families, they were a burden. And for caravan drivers, they were a grind of endless miles, endless sacks, endless tallies. Over time, the salt monopoly grew into one of China's most important institutions. Later dynasties, from the Song to the Ming and Qing, adopted and expanded it. The principles remained the same. Production was controlled, caravans were inspected, and taxes were collected through counting. In this way, the Tang system outlived the dynasty itself. The dull repetition of tallying sacks left behind a tradition that endured for more than 1,000 years. The consequences were wide-reaching. Revenues from salt-funded armies that defended the empire's borders. They paid for canals that linked provinces, for palaces that housed emperors, and for civil servants who kept order. Without salt revenues, the Tang court could not have maintained its strength. Every tally made at a checkpoint, every sack verified by a clerk, helped sustain the grandeur of the dynasty. Yet the system also deepened divides. Smugglers flourished wherever taxes were heavy. In some regions, entire communities depended on illegal salt. For them, state counting meant oppression. They found ways around it, carrying sacks along hidden trails, bribing guards, or disguising salt as flour. The official registers recorded order, but beneath the surface disorder spread. This tension between official counting and unofficial evasion never disappeared. It was part of the empire's fabric. The human experience of this system should not be forgotten. Drivers walked thousands of miles, guiding animals across deserts and mountains. Their lives were measured in tallies, their earnings tied to sacks delivered and verified. Clerks bent over registers, writing numbers until their hands cramped. They rarely saw the wealth their work supported. They did not dine in palaces or command armies. Their reward was survival, perhaps modest respect, but little glory. The empire they sustained barely remembered them, and yet their work mattered. Without their patience, the empire would have faltered. Without their tallies, revenues would have dwindled. Without their endurance, families would have lacked the salt that preserved their food. The monotony of their days carried the weight of survival for millions. What remains today are fragments. Old registers and archives, references in official histories, archaeological traces of salt wells and trade routes. These traces remind us that the great Tang dynasty was not built only by poets, generals, or emperors. It was built by anonymous men and women who counted, hauled, and endured. Their story is boring, but it is the truth of history. So as you finish this account, let the image linger of a clerk in a dusty station, marking a tally stick by lamplight. His work seems small, but it carried the empire's weight. And it leaves us with a question worth asking even now. Do the foundations of power rest not in glory, but in the quiet persistence of counting what everyone else ignores? The uneventful life of a Byzantine palace eunuch. When you think of Byzantium, it is easy to picture its brilliance. The golden mosaics of Hagia Sophia glowing in candlelight. The sound of hymns echoing through long corridors. Emperors seated on thrones, surrounded by courtiers in embroidered robes. Yet alongside this magnificence lived men whose lives were far more restrained. They were the eunuchs of the Byzantine palace, servants whose bodies and futures had been altered early in life. Their purpose was to serve. Their days, for the most part, were uneventful. The Byzantine palace was not one building, but a complex of halls, courtyards, chapels, and offices spread across Constantinople. It was a city within a city. Eunuchs lived and worked here, forming a class apart from the rest of society. They were cut off from family life, unable to marry or produce heirs, and yet they were trusted with tasks that required absolute loyalty. In a world where dynasties defined power, eunuchs were considered safe. They could not pass influence to sons, and so emperors felt secure surrounding themselves with them. Most eunuchs entered palace service as boys. Some were taken as captives from border regions, others were given by poor families in hopes of gaining favor, and some came from within the empire itself. The procedure that shaped their lives is one we will not dwell on here, but its consequence was profound. It marked them as different forever. Once in the palace, they were trained in literacy, manners, and ceremony. They learned to read and write Greek, to chant prayers, to keep records, and to move silently in the emperor's presence. From that moment forward, their lives were bound to duty. A typical day began before dawn. Bells or calls from the palace heralded the start of the routine. Eunuchs rose from shared quarters, simple dormitories with wooden beds, plain blankets, and few possessions. They ate light breakfasts, bread, olives, perhaps some cheese or dried figs. Food was provided by the palace, never lavish, always sufficient. Then they dressed. Their robes were plain compared to the silks of nobles, but they marked their position with colors or belts appropriate to their rank. Each detail of their clothing was prescribed by tradition, signaling order and hierarchy. From there, the day divided into tasks. Some eunuchs served as chamberlains, controlling access to the emperor. They stood at doors, ensuring that no one entered without permission. Others served in treasury offices, copying accounts, checking inventories, and managing payments to officials or soldiers. Some tended to relics in the palace chapels, preparing candles and incense for services. Others guided ambassadors through ceremonial processions, teaching them when to bow, where to stand, how to move. Eunuchs were the hidden stage managers of Byzantine ceremony, ensuring that the court appeared orderly and majestic. The work required discipline. An audience with the emperor, for example, was not a spontaneous event. It was staged like a performance. Eunuchs arranged the room, positioned courtiers, opened doors at the right moment, and held objects such as staffs or regalia. They ensured that ambassadors saw what the empire wanted them to see, a ruler surrounded by perfect order. In this sense, eunuchs were invisible yet essential. Without them, the illusion of imperial majesty could not have been maintained. But most of their duties were quieter. Many eunuchs served as scribes, filling parchment with neat Greek script. Their offices smelled of ink and wax. Tables were stacked with scrolls and codices. The scratching of pens filled the air. They copied petitions from subjects, recorded decrees from the emperor, or updated lists of supplies in palace storerooms. The work was repetitive, but repetition was the heart of bureaucracy. Through their records, taxes were tracked, goods were distributed, and officials were appointed. It was not glorious work, but it was essential. Life in the palace was highly structured. Bells marked hours for prayer. Eunuchs often attended services in the palace chapels, chanting psalms alongside monks and priests. Afterward, they returned to duty. Meals were eaten at appointed times, often in shared halls. Evenings were quiet. Some eunuchs read religious texts. Others copied manuscripts as an act of devotion. Few left the palace grounds without permission. Their world was enclosed by walls, their lives enclosed by routine. Socially, eunuchs stood in an ambiguous position. They were neither slaves nor fully free. They could hold important offices, even rise to become generals or patriarchs, but most remained mid-level servants. They were respected for their loyalty but mocked for their difference. Satirists wrote cruel verses about them. Common people often mistrusted them, whispering that they wielded hidden influence. Yet within the palace, they were indispensable. Their separation from family life was precisely why emperors valued them. They were symbols of loyalty without lineage, service without inheritance. The uneventfulness of their lives can be seen in the records. Historians rarely mention ordinary eunuchs. They appear only when promoted to high office or when embroiled in intrigue. For the majority, there is silence. We know they copied, recorded, and served, but not what they felt. Their voices are lost. What remains are the structures they upheld. Rituals, registers, ceremonies that gave Byzantium its character. It is worth pausing to imagine their inner lives. Did they feel pride when carrying regalia in a grand procession? Did they feel loneliness in their shared dormitories, watching families gather outside palace walls? Did they resent their condition or accept it as destiny? The records do not tell us. What we can say is that their survival depended on obedience. By serving quietly, they secured food, shelter, and relative safety. Their uneventful lives were perhaps less dramatic, but also less dangerous than those of soldiers or peasants. Consider one example, a eunuch assigned to the treasury. His day was spent copying figures, checking inventories of gold coins or bolts of silk. He worked under supervision, double-checking sums. At night, he left the office and walked through marble corridors lit by oil lamps. He passed guards, bowed before icons, and returned to his quarters. Day after day, the same routine. Decades could pass like this with little change except the faces of emperors. Such a life may sound monotonous, but it provided stability in a world often shaken by wars and rebellions. Eunuchs also served as guardians of relics and libraries. In the palace chapels, they tended to icons believed to protect the empire. They cleaned lamps, arranged offerings, and recorded donations. In libraries, they copied manuscripts, ensuring that texts of theology, law, and history survived. In this quiet labor, they became transmitters of culture. Without their boring diligence, many Byzantine texts would not have reached later generations. Even in ceremony, their roles were restrained. They rarely spoke, instead moving silently, carrying objects, opening doors, guiding processions. They were part of the choreography of empire, visible yet voiceless. Their value lay in their predictability. Ambassadors might marvel at the emperor's majesty, but it was eunuchs who made the display seamless. Their uneventful presence ensured the empire appeared eternal. You have already seen how the eunuchs of Byzantium lived within the palace, bound by routine and separated from ordinary life. To go further, you must look at the systems that shaped their service. Their uneventful days were not simply personal habits, but reflections of a larger bureaucracy, a carefully maintained structure that depended on their discipline. The Byzantine court was one of the most ceremonial in history. Every gesture, every robe, every phrase was planned. Eunuchs were woven into this ceremonial machine. They stood at doorways, opened curtains, carried documents, and announced arrivals. Their silence reinforced hierarchy. By controlling access to the emperor, they also controlled the flow of information. In this way, even eunuchs of modest rank wielded influence. If you wanted an audience with the emperor, you needed their cooperation. If they delayed or denied you, your petition might never reach the throne. Yet this influence was not flamboyant. It was exercised through dull persistence at thresholds and tables. Much of their authority lay in paperwork. Eunuchs filled offices as secretaries and record keepers. The empire survived through documents, decrees, tax lists, inventories, and letters. Every piece of parchment passed through hands trained to keep it safe and correct. For hours each day, eunuchs copied figures, sealed papers with wax, and filed them into chests or cupboards. They became experts in repetition. The monotony of transcription, line after line in neat Greek minuscule, defined their existence. And yet, this monotony provided continuity. An emperor might reign for 10 years or 20, but eunuchs copied records decade after decade, ensuring that bureaucracy outlasted rulers. The palace treasury depended heavily on them. Eunuchs supervised storerooms of silk, coin, and precious metals. They checked weights, locked chests, and signed registers. They ensured that salaries for soldiers and stipends for clerics were recorded accurately. The trust placed in them was enormous. Soldiers rioted if pay was late. Bishops complained if stipends were reduced. The empire's order relied on eunuchs who spent their days counting coins and writing receipts. Their work was invisible to the crowds in Constantinople, but it kept the empire's economy running. They also played roles in the sacred life of the empire. The Byzantine court was deeply religious, blending politics with ritual. Eunuchs tended relics, carried candles in processions, and managed chapels within the palace. They prepared altars, cleaned icons, and recorded donations. Their work was not glorious, but it was steady. Each day, they ensured that worship continued without interruption. For ambassadors visiting from distant lands, these processions were evidence of Byzantine power. For the eunuchs, they were just another duty, repeated week after week, year after year. Life for most eunuchs was not one of upward mobility. A few rose to great prominence. Names like Narses, the eunuch general of the 6th century, survive in history books. Others became patriarchs or advisors to emperors. But such figures were rare exceptions. The majority remained in mid-level posts for their entire lives, repeating the same tasks under one emperor after another. Their careers were less about ambition and more about endurance. They might serve for decades without recognition, retiring quietly or dying in their quarters. Their anonymity was part of their role. This anonymity shaped how others saw them. Satirists mocked them as half men, suspicious, and unnatural. Rumors portrayed them as schemers whispering behind curtains. Yet the reality was often far more boring. Most eunuchs were neither schemers nor heroes. They were functionaries. They spent their days reading petitions, stamping documents, and guarding doors. Their influence came not from plots but from persistence. They were always there, always present, always watching, always recording. In their constancy lay their power. The uneventfulness of their lives is especially clear in the records of palace routines. Manuals of court ceremony describe where eunuchs stood during processions, how they held candles, how they handed objects to the emperor. The detail is astonishing, every movement prescribed. But when you read these manuals, you notice the sameness. Each day repeated the last. Each ceremony repeated ceremonies before it. Eunuchs were not improvisers. They were actors in a script, performing the same roles year after year. Theirs was a life of ritualized boredom. Yet boredom did not mean irrelevance. In fact, the monotony of eunuchs preserved the empire's continuity. While soldiers fought on borders and emperors faced intrigue, the eunuchs ensured that ceremonies continued, documents were copied, and relics were tended. They embodied stability. To the outside world, Byzantium seemed eternal, unchanging. This illusion was maintained by the repetitive work of eunuchs who never faltered in their routines. Their daily life carried both privileges and burdens. They lived within the palace, protected from famine and invasion. They had access to food, clothing, and shelter, but they also lived under constant surveillance. Their movements were restricted. Their roles were defined. They could not form families. They could not leave legacies. Their identity was their service. To step outside that service was to risk exile or punishment. Thus, they endured quietly, accepting that their lives belonged not to themselves but to the empire. What did this do to their sense of self? We can only guess. Some may have found satisfaction in their closeness to power, in their small roles within grand ceremonies. Others may have felt trapped, repeating the same tasks without hope of change. Their silence in the records leaves us with uncertainty, but perhaps their endurance itself is the answer. They lived without glory, without recognition, but also without collapse. Their uneventful lives gave them stability in a world that often seemed unstable. As you picture them, imagine the palace corridors at night. Oil lamps flicker, guards stand at posts, eunuchs move quietly, carrying messages or checking locks. No drama unfolds, no intrigue is written into the chronicles. Only the slow rhythm of duty continues. Each step echoes in marble halls, each page of parchment fills with neat script. This is their legacy. Quiet repetition, invisible but essential. You have walked the corridors of the Byzantine palace with its eunuchs, seen their routines, and glimpsed their roles in bureaucracy, ceremony, and devotion. To conclude their story, you must look at their long-term place in history. What legacy did they leave? And what does their quiet endurance tell us about how empires function? The Byzantine Empire endured for over 1,000 years, longer than almost any other empire in history. It survived invasions, plagues, revolts, and dynastic struggles. One reason it endured was its bureaucracy, and eunuchs were at the heart of that system. They did not rule, but they ensured continuity. Their lives were often dull, filled with repetition, but repetition is what kept Byzantium alive. Consider the reigns of emperors. Some were strong and capable, others weak and fleeting. Dynasties rose and fell, generals rebelled, factions fought in the hippodrome. Through it all, eunuchs kept the palace running. They opened doors for new emperors just as they had for old ones. They copied decrees regardless of who sat on the throne. They managed treasury accounts even as wars drained resources. Their uneventful service provided stability in a world of constant change. Yet their position remained paradoxical. Eunuchs were indispensable, yet mistrusted. They could hold high office, yet they were mocked in literature and popular speech. Ordinary people viewed them with suspicion, imagining them as schemers whispering behind curtains. But the reality was less dramatic. Most eunuchs were not plotters. They were bureaucrats, functionaries, guardians of procedure. Their influence lay not in intrigue but in consistency. Occasionally, a eunuch did rise to prominence. Narses in the 6th century commanded armies against the Ostrogoths. Others served as patriarchs of Constantinople or advisors to emperors. But these cases were rare. For the majority, life was not about power. It was about duty. They filled ledgers, guided ceremonies, and guarded relics without recognition. Their lives passed in obscurity, recorded only in the silent testimony of parchment and ritual manuals. What did this mean for them personally? Without families, they lacked the ties that gave meaning to most lives in Byzantium. They could not pass property to heirs. They could not join household dynasties. Their identities were defined by their offices. Some may have sought comfort in religion, devoting themselves to prayer and service. Others may have formed close bonds with fellow eunuchs, finding companionship in shared experience. But ultimately, their lives were narrow, bounded by the walls of the palace. Their uneventful existence is a reminder of how history is built. We remember emperors, generals, and saints, but it was clerks, chamberlains, and attendants who kept the machinery of empire turning. The eunuchs of Byzantium exemplify this truth. Their work was dull, yet it was foundational. Without their steady presence, the empire's grand ceremonies would have faltered. Its treasury would have been disordered, its relics neglected. They embodied the invisible labor that sustains civilizations. Their legacy is also cultural. In art and literature, eunuchs appear as symbols of the court's strangeness. Writers from the West often portrayed them as evidence of Byzantium's decadence. Satirists within the empire mocked their appearance and voices, but such portrayals missed the essence of their role. They were not exotic curiosities. They were functionaries, no more strange than scribes in other empires, simply marked by a condition that set them apart. Their uneventful service, not their difference, was what mattered most. The archaeological record gives us glimpses. Seals bearing eunuchs' names survive, showing that some reached positions of responsibility. Manuscripts copied by their hands remain in libraries. Ceremonial manuals describe their duties in exacting detail. These fragments are enough to remind us that, though anonymous, they were real men who lived, worked, and died within the palace. Their silence in chronicles does not erase their presence. It only reflects the invisibility of routine. When you reflect on their lives, you may find them sad, cut off from families, bound to service, living in anonymity. But another view is possible. In a violent world, they had security. They ate regularly, slept in safety, and were spared the dangers of war and famine. Their uneventful lives may not have been joyous, but they were stable. For many in Byzantium, stability was a rare gift. The peasant who feared harvest failure, the soldier who risked death on campaign, the artisan who struggled with poverty. None enjoyed the same continuity as the eunuch at his desk. This perspective shifts how we understand their contribution. They were not tragic victims, nor were they secret manipulators. They were workers embedded in an empire that valued their loyalty. Their uneventful lives were meaningful not because of drama, but because of persistence. Every day they copied, guarded, and arranged, and in doing so, they outlasted the glories of emperors who rose and fell. By the end of Byzantium, eunuchs were still present in the palace, still performing their tasks. When the empire finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453, they were among those who saw the last ceremonies in Hagia Sophia, who copied the last decrees, who guarded the last relics. Their lives ended not with recognition but with the silence of conquest. Yet their centuries of service had already left a mark. So what lesson do their lives leave us? Perhaps it is that history is not sustained by heroes alone. It is sustained by the boring, repetitive work of people who will never be remembered by name. The eunuchs of Byzantium embodied this truth. They were invisible, mocked, and uneventful. But without them, the empire's illusion of eternity would have collapsed much sooner. Picture them one last time. A line of eunuchs walking slowly through marble corridors, carrying candles, opening doors, guiding a foreign envoy toward the emperor's chamber. Their faces are calm, their steps measured, their presence steady. Nothing dramatic happens, no intrigue unfolds. And yet, in that uneventful procession, the empire's grandeur is maintained. Theirs is a story not of glory, but of endurance. And so the question lingers. When you measure the greatness of an empire, should you look only at emperors and battles, or should you also honor the uneventful lives of those who held it together, line by line, step by step, day after day? Peculiar sleep remedies of Victorian England. Sleep was never taken for granted in the Victorian age. Industrial noise, crowded cities, and long workdays made rest difficult, and the medical science of the time offered few reliable solutions. Instead, Victorians turned to an assortment of remedies, many of them peculiar, most of them ineffective, but all of them carefully documented in medical guides, newspapers, and household manuals. To understand how ordinary people sought rest in 19th century England, you must step into their bedrooms, pharmacies, and imaginations, and trace the quiet rituals they used to chase sleep. A Victorian bedroom was different from our own. Gas lamps flickered or candles burned low. The air smelled of coal smoke drifting in from the streets. Beds were high, often with heavy curtains that shut out drafts. For many, mattresses were stuffed with horsehair or straw, uncomfortable by modern standards. Sheets were coarse, blankets thick. Sleep was elusive not only because of environment but also because of anxiety. Industrial schedules demanded early mornings, and many Victorians worried about health, morality, and productivity. In this context, a cure for sleeplessness became a small but pressing need. One of the simplest remedies was dietary. Medical writers recommended avoiding heavy suppers, spicy foods, or alcohol late at night. Warm milk was praised as a soporific, sometimes flavored with nutmeg or cinnamon. Oatmeal gruel, a dish otherwise associated with poverty, was suggested as a calming night food. Herbal teas, chamomile, valerian root, and hops were popular across classes. Apothecaries sold dried herbs in small paper packets, and households steeped them in kettles before bed. The rituals were soothing, if not always effective. Another remedy was bathing. Middle-class manuals advised a warm bath before sleep, sometimes with added herbs or salts. Wealthier families experimented with Turkish baths, believing steam would relax the body. At the same time, cold baths were also prescribed, on the theory that shock to the body restored natural rhythms. Some even recommended alternating hot and cold plunges, a regimen both inconvenient and uncomfortable. These practices reflected the era's fascination with water as both cure and punishment. Mechanical aids appeared too. Special pillows stuffed with lavender or hops were marketed as sleep promoters. Weighted blankets filled with bran or sand were sold for those prone to tossing and turning. Beds were sometimes tilted slightly to improve circulation. Even furniture makers joined the business, designing chairs that reclined at angles thought to encourage drowsiness. In every case, sleep was treated not as a natural process but as something that required intervention. Drugs, of course, played a role. Laudanum, an opium tincture mixed with alcohol, was widely available and often prescribed for insomnia. It dulled the senses, but it was addictive and dangerous. Chloral hydrate, introduced later in the century, became one of the first chemical sleeping pills. Newspapers advertised it as a modern marvel, though doctors soon warned of its side effects. Ordinary families sometimes turned to simpler concoctions, mixtures of vinegar and honey, or syrups with alcohol as a base. Children, too, were given sedatives, a practice that horrifies us now but was common in households where parents needed peace after long workdays. Some remedies drifted into superstition. People placed pieces of iron under their pillows to ward off nightmares, or carried amulets said to calm restless spirits. Manuals suggested placing sprigs of rosemary at the bedside or hanging charms above doors. Folk beliefs about sleep blended with medical advice, producing routines that were as much about comfort as science. For the sleepless, any ritual, no matter how strange, offered a sense of control. Victorians also linked sleep to morality. Writers warned against overstimulation from novels, theater, or excessive socializing. They recommended prayer or Bible reading before bed, framing sleep as both physical rest and moral discipline. Early rising was praised as virtuous, while oversleeping was condemned as sloth. In this way, Sleep was never just a private act but a reflection of character. To sleep well was to live well. To suffer insomnia was both a medical problem and a moral failing. The remedies extended into the design of homes. Manuals advised that bedrooms be well ventilated, with windows slightly open. In cities choked with smoke, this advice was difficult to follow. Wealthier families installed air flues or experimented with ventilation systems. Working-class families often shared cramped rooms, where sleep was interrupted by coughing, snoring, and restless children. Remedies for these conditions were rarely effective. Manuals written for the middle class ignored the realities of the poor. Advertisements for sleep products filled newspapers. Companies sold tonics, teas, syrups, and devices with promises of natural, refreshing rest. Testimonials claimed miraculous results. One brand of herbal tea promised to quiet the nerves after railway journeys. Another syrup claimed to prevent nightmares. Most of these products relied on alcohol, sugar, or herbs with mild sedative properties. But their popularity showed how widespread sleep troubles were in industrial England. Doctors debated the causes of sleeplessness. Some blamed nervous disorders, a vague term covering anxiety, stress, and overwork. Others pointed to diet or digestion. A few suggested that sleeplessness reflected spiritual unrest, urging patients to embrace faith. Medical journals filled with case studies. Men unable to sleep after long hours in factories, women lying awake with hysterical nerves, children restless after city excitement. Each case produced new prescriptions but few real solutions. And yet, for all their failures, these remedies mattered. They gave people routines to follow, rituals to soothe worry. A cup of chamomile tea, a sprig of lavender, a prayer whispered before bed. Each was a small comfort. The remedies were boring, repetitive, but they carried meaning. They remind us that sleep, so natural to us, has always been shaped by culture, science, and belief. Picture an ordinary Victorian night. A clerk returns home late from his office, weary but restless. He eats a light supper, drinks warm milk with nutmeg, and sits by candlelight reading a devotional text. His wife prepares a hop-stuffed pillow, ties curtains around the bed to block the draft, and whispers a short prayer. They blow out the candles. Coal smoke lingers in the air. Outside, the city is noisy, but inside, rituals of sleep have been completed. Whether rest comes or not, the remedies have done their part. The image is not dramatic. It is quiet, repetitive, almost uneventful. But that is the truth of history. Most lives were lived not in battles or discoveries, but in small routines meant to secure peace. For Victorians, sleep remedies were one of those routines. They reveal a culture anxious about rest, eager for solutions, and willing to trust anything that promised even a few hours of peace. And yet, one question lingers. Did these peculiar remedies truly bring rest, or did they simply offer the illusion of control in a sleepless world? The remedies that Victorians used to chase sleep were many, but understanding them requires more than listing herbs and potions. You must see how these remedies fit into daily life, how they reflected class differences, and how they were shaped by the broader medical culture of the 19th century. Begin with the middle classes, who consumed a steady stream of household manuals and medical advice books. These guides instructed families on how to manage their health at home, often before consulting a physician. Sleep was treated as a vital indicator of well-being. A good night's rest was seen as a sign of balance, while persistent sleeplessness suggested deeper trouble. Manuals offered practical advice. Keep bedrooms airy, avoid coffee or tea after supper, walk in the fresh air before bed, and repeat calming prayers. Remedies were not just physical but moral. Sleep was framed as the reward of disciplined living. For the working classes, conditions were harsher. Many lived in cramped dwellings with multiple family members sharing beds or rooms. Coal smoke, dampness, and constant noise made sleep elusive. Remedies in manuals often assumed space, privacy, and resources that the poor did not have. A working-class family could rarely afford lavender pillows or elaborate baths. Instead, they relied on simpler measures. A mug of ale to dull the senses, a pipe before bed, or a cheap herbal infusion bought at a local shop. Their remedies reflected necessity, not luxury. Among the wealthy, sleep was treated almost as a science. Physicians visited homes, prescribing regimens tailored to individual patients. Wealthy insomniacs tried seaside holidays, believing sea air and bathing could restore natural rhythms. Some traveled to spas on the continent, where mineral waters and rest were thought to cure sleeplessness. They could afford imported teas, rare herbs, and the latest chemical sedatives. Their remedies were more varied, but they still shared the same anxiety. That sleeplessness threatened both health and respectability. Doctors increasingly recommended chemical solutions. Laudanum remained common, but by mid-century its dangers were widely recognized. Chloral hydrate emerged in the 1860s, touted as a scientific breakthrough. Advertisements claimed it induced natural sleep, though patients reported grogginess and dependence. Bromides also gained popularity, prescribed to calm the nervous system. These drugs were often taken without strict oversight, leading to overuse. Yet their presence reveals a shift. Sleep was no longer only about ritual or morality, but about chemistry, measurable and controllable. At the same time, folk remedies persisted. Many still believed in charms or superstitions. Some placed horseshoes above doors to ward off nightmares. Others burned herbs near the bed, not just for scent but to chase away spirits. Parents tucked sprigs of rosemary or rue into children's pillows, convinced they prevented restless nights. These traditions coexisted with modern medicine, showing how Victorians lived between faith in science and trust in older customs. The remedies also reflected gender expectations. Women were thought more prone to nervous disorders, and insomnia was often described as a female condition. Doctors attributed it to hysteria, reproductive health, or emotional sensitivity. Female patients were prescribed rest cures, herbal teas, or mild sedatives. Men, by contrast, were advised to regulate diet and exercise. A sleepless man was told to avoid tobacco or alcohol, while a sleepless woman was told to avoid overexcitement or mental strain. Thus, remedies reinforced ideas about gender roles, presenting men as rational bodies and women as fragile nerves. Sleep remedies extended into children's lives as well. Parents worried about restless infants in crowded homes. Soothing syrups, often containing alcohol, opium, or morphine, were sold widely, marketed with gentle names that concealed their potency. Mother's friend or infant's quietness promised peace for both child and parent. While these remedies calmed babies, they carried risks of dependence or harm. Yet desperate families used them, valuing sleep above safety. Their popularity shows how universal the struggle for rest was in Victorian society. Religious influence also shaped remedies. Clergy preached that prayer before bed purified the mind and calmed the soul. Sermons linked sleeplessness to guilt or moral unrest. Manuals urged families to read scripture together before retiring. Psalms were recited as lullabies. Even in a century fascinated by science, spiritual routines remained central. Sleep was framed as a gift from God, withheld when the conscience was troubled. In this way, remedies for sleeplessness blurred the line between medicine and morality. Technology introduced new challenges. Gas lighting extended work hours and kept cities bright into the night. Railway travel disrupted natural rhythms, with passengers arriving late and struggling to rest after long journeys. Medical writers warned that modern life itself caused sleeplessness, and remedies were presented as defenses against the stress of progress. Chamomile tea, lavender pillows, or bromide powders became ways to restore the balance lost in an industrial age. Advertising amplified this anxiety. Newspapers and magazines carried columns filled with testimonials. A woman in Manchester praised a hop pillow for curing her insomnia. A gentleman in London swore by a particular syrup. Illustrations showed families sleeping peacefully after using a product. Behind the optimism was a profitable industry. Sleep had become a commodity, and remedies were marketed as essentials for modern living. For all their variety, these remedies shared one feature: repetition. Whether drinking warm milk, steeping herbs, saying prayers, or taking a draught of medicine, Victorians followed routines. The routine itself often mattered as much as the substance. Repetition gave comfort. It offered a sense of control over something as unpredictable as sleep. Even when remedies failed, they provided ritual. And ritual was its own form of rest. Consider an ordinary evening in a middle-class home. A father returns from work, weary but tense. He eats a light supper, avoiding strong tea. A mother prepares chamomile for both of them, placing a lavender pillow near the bed. Children are given warm baths, then read scripture verses aloud. Finally, candles are extinguished, curtains drawn. The remedies are not dramatic. They are small gestures layered one upon another, part of the rhythm of daily life. Whether sleep follows is uncertain, but the family has done what manuals and tradition recommend. The ritual itself eases the night. These routines reveal something profound about Victorian culture. Sleep was never just rest. It was tied to health, morality, family order, and even politics. To sleep well was to show discipline. To suffer sleeplessness was to signal imbalance. Remedies, peculiar as they seem to us, reflected a society grappling with modern anxieties through old traditions. And here lies the unresolved thought. Were these remedies truly cures, or were they performances? Quiet nightly rituals that reassured more than they healed? You have seen how Victorians experimented with diets, baths, pillows, syrups, and prayers in their search for sleep. You have seen how remedies differed across class, gender, and age, and how they blended science with superstition. To conclude their story, you must ask what these peculiar remedies meant in the long run, and how they shaped not only sleep but the culture of 19th century England. At the heart of Victorian remedies was anxiety. Industrialization had changed the rhythm of life. Cities grew louder and dirtier. Gas lamps and railways disrupted natural cycles of day and night. Work became more rigidly timed, demanding punctuality and discipline. In this context, sleeplessness was more than inconvenience. It was a threat to health, productivity, and morality. Every failed night of rest carried implications for the next day's labor. Remedies, no matter how odd, were ways to manage this anxiety. Medical writers framed sleep as a necessity for both body and mind. They argued that sleeplessness drained vitality, weakened nerves, and shortened life. Popular manuals warned readers that poor sleep could lead to melancholy, hysteria, or consumption. The message was clear. Without rest, you were at risk. This fear fueled the demand for solutions. Remedies multiplied not only because people needed them, but because doctors and businesses found profit in feeding worry. Yet most remedies were modest. A cup of chamomile tea, a pillow stuffed with hops, a warm bath, or a whispered prayer. None were dramatic. They worked more as rituals than as cures. By repeating them nightly, people created a sense of control. Even when they failed, the act of trying was reassuring. This is why remedies persisted despite limited success. They gave meaning to sleepless nights, turning frustration into ritual. Some remedies left lasting influence. Herbal teas remain popular as calming drinks. Warm milk before bed is still recommended in households today. Lavender pillows are sold as natural sleep aids. These traditions trace back to the 19th century, when families first embraced them as nightly habits. The peculiar world of Victorian remedies laid foundations for modern routines. Others, however, have vanished. Opium syrups for children, chemical sedatives like chloral hydrate, and bromides fell into disuse as medicine advanced. Their dangers became clearer, and regulation removed them from shops. The memory of these substances reminds us how easily anxiety can lead societies to embrace harmful cures. What was once ordinary in Victorian nurseries would today be condemned as reckless. Gendered remedies also reveal cultural patterns. Women were often told that sleeplessness reflected weakness, overemotion, or hysteria. Doctors prescribed calming routines and discouraged mental stimulation. Men were told to regulate diet and exercise, to balance bodies made restless by overwork. Remedies reflected stereotypes as much as science. In this way, sleep became another field where Victorian society enforced gender roles. The remedies also mirrored class divides. Wealthy patients sought seaside cures, mineral baths, or imported sedatives. Middle-class families followed manuals, experimenting with teas and pillows. The poor relied on cheap alcohol or folk customs, sometimes with dangerous effects. Sleep, like everything else in Victorian life, reflected inequality. Remedies did not remove hardship, they revealed it. And yet, despite these differences, one thread connected all classes: the belief that sleeplessness required action. To do nothing was to risk health and morality. Whether through prayer, potions, or pillows, every household developed routines. This insistence on intervention reveals a broader Victorian trait: faith in discipline, routine, and self-management. Even sleep, a natural process, was turned into a task to be managed. What can we learn from this today? Perhaps that societies often respond to anxiety not with solutions, but with rituals. Remedies do not always work, but they create order. The Victorians were not unique in this. We too surround ourselves with sleep apps, white noise machines, weighted blankets, and melatonin tablets. Like Victorian remedies, these tools blend science with ritual, offering comfort even when their results are uncertain. The story of Victorian sleep is, in truth, the story of all societies trying to manage the unpredictability of rest. To close, picture one last Victorian household at night. The city outside is noisy, trains whistling, horses clattering on cobblestones. Inside, a father finishes a glass of ale, a mother lights lavender near the bed, a child is given a spoonful of syrup, curtains are drawn, prayers whispered, candles snuffed out. Darkness settles, and the family lies still, waiting for sleep. Whether it comes quickly or slowly, the rituals themselves have done their work. They have given structure to rest, meaning to the night, and a sense of peace in a restless age. The remedies may seem peculiar to us, but they tell a truth that endures. Sleep is never just biological. It is cultural, moral, and historical. The Victorians, in their endless search for rest, remind us that even the quietest routines of life can reveal the deepest anxieties of an age. And so the question lingers: were Victorian remedies truly about sleep, or were they about soothing the fears of a society that had forgotten how to rest? The bureaucratic duties of Edo Japan's paper merchants. When you imagine Edo Japan, perhaps you picture samurai walking through castle towns, kabuki actors performing on crowded stages, or merchants in bright robes selling rice and silk. Yet one of the most essential trades of the period was far less glamorous: the paper trade. Paper was everywhere in Edo society, used for documents, screens, lanterns, umbrellas, books, and even clothing linings. Merchants who dealt in it lived not in drama but in routine. Their duties were bureaucratic, repetitive, and carefully recorded. To understand the quiet power of paper in Edo life, you must step into their shops and ledgers, where every sheet was counted, taxed, and tracked. Paper had long been valued in Japan, but by the Tokugawa period, 1603 to 1868, it had become indispensable. The shogunate relied on paper for records, decrees, and official correspondence. Temples needed it for sutras, merchants for contracts, and households for daily items like shoji screens and wrapping paper. Demand was constant. Paper merchants, known as kamiya, formed guilds in major cities like Edo, modern Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto. Their business was not dramatic trading voyages but steady supply, measured in bundles and rolls, recorded carefully in registers. A typical day for a paper merchant began early. Shop shutters were lifted at dawn, revealing shelves stacked with rolls of mulberry paper, packets of tissue, and heavier sheets for writing. The merchant sat at a low desk with an abacus, paper samples, and ink. Customers arrived steadily: a clerk from a local magistrate's office ordering official sheets, a craftsman needing paper for lanterns, a monk purchasing sutra copying paper. Each order was measured, recorded, and added to accounts. The process was repetitive but precise. The production of paper itself was laborious. Villages in provinces like Ekizan or Mino specialized in hand-making paper from mulberry bark. Women boiled, pounded, and spread fibers on frames, producing sheets that were dried and stacked. Caravans delivered these bundles to cities, where merchants distributed them. Every shipment was noted in ledgers, how many bundles arrived, from which village, at what cost. These details were checked against taxes owed. The merchant's day often included cross-checking deliveries, writing receipts, and preparing payments. Taxes shaped the trade. The Tokugawa shogunate regulated guilds, fixing prices and requiring merchants to provide paper for official use. Merchants recorded not only sales but also quotas of paper delivered to government offices. Failing to meet quotas invited penalties. Thus, merchants became minor bureaucrats, their ledgers extensions of state control. They worked under constant watch, balancing profit with duty. Their role was less that of free traders than of regulated suppliers embedded in the shogunate system. The paperwork of paper was endless. Contracts were written for every bulk order. Receipts were stamped with seals. Ledgers listed dates, amounts, and clients. Copies were made for guild records. Merchants often spent as much time writing as selling. In their shops, the scratching of brushes against paper was as common as the rustle of sheets being unrolled. Their lives revolved around ink and numbers, not glamour or wealth. Yet their work mattered profoundly. Without merchants, magistrates lacked the paper for edicts, monasteries lacked the sheets for sutras, and households lacked screens for privacy. The merchants' dull tallying sustained the cultural and political life of Edo Japan. They were anonymous figures behind the scenes, but their product shaped the texture of daily existence. Socially, paper merchants occupied a low rank in the rigid Tokugawa hierarchy. Samurai stood at the top, followed by peasants, artisans, and finally merchants. Merchants were often despised as profit seekers. Yet paradoxically, paper merchants wielded quiet importance. They were essential to the bureaucracy and culture of the era. Guild membership gave them stability, though not prestige. Their wealth could not easily be turned into social advancement. Instead, they found dignity in their craft, in reliable supply, and in the respect of those who relied on their goods. The rhythm of their day rarely changed. Morning brought deliveries and early customers. Afternoon was filled with orders, accounting, and correspondence. Evening meant balancing the books, calculating profits, and preparing reports for guild overseers. Meals were simple, eaten quickly before returning to ledgers. Their households revolved around the shop, with family members helping to cut, wrap, and package paper. Children often learned arithmetic and brushwork early, trained to inherit the trade. One striking feature of Edo paper culture was variety. Merchants sold hundreds of kinds of paper, each suited to a purpose. Thin tissue for cosmetics, durable sheets for umbrellas, decorative pattern paper for poetry and gifts, heavy writing paper for government decrees. Each type had its price, and merchants memorized these variations. Their ledgers recorded not just amounts but categories. Accuracy was essential, for mistakes in type or measure could mean disputes. The dull repetition of these duties produced continuity. For decades, guilds maintained stable supply, ensuring that paper shortages were rare. This stability allowed literature, theater, and education to flourish. Popular fiction circulated in cheap woodblock printed booklets. Wrapping paper carried shop names across the city, and kabuki theaters used paper for posters and stage props. All of this depended on merchants who tallied quietly in their shops. Never celebrated, always necessary. What can be said of their inner lives? Like the eunuchs of Byzantium or the bakers of Rome, their voices are largely absent. We know them through guild records, tax registers, and surviving account books. Their daily concerns were likely practical: securing supply, meeting quotas, balancing books. Yet behind the monotony, there may have been pride. To sell a sheet of paper that carried a monk's scripture or a poet's verse was to play a part in culture, even if unrecognized. To provide the material for government decrees was to sustain order, even if despised as a merchant. Their uneventful routines were the scaffolding of society. Picture one of them closing shop at night. The shutters are drawn. The day's accounts are tallied in neat brushstrokes. Bundles of unsold paper are wrapped and stored carefully against damp. Candles burn low. Outside, Edo streets are noisy with vendors and laughter. But inside, the merchant's world is silent, filled with paper stacks and ledgers. His day has been boring by any measure, yet without it, the empire of documents and culture would falter. And here lies the question. In a society that honored samurai and poets, did the paper merchants see themselves as invisible servants of others, or did they know, quietly, that without their endless records and supplies, the entire machinery of Edo life would collapse? The life of a paper merchant in Edo, Japan was not only about selling sheets and tallying bundles. It was also about navigating guild rules, regulations imposed by the shogunate, and the endless obligations of bureaucracy. Their duties were woven into systems of control that made them more like minor officials than independent traders. To understand them fully, you must step into the world of guild politics, state oversight, and cultural expectations that shaped their routines. The Tokugawa shogunate valued order above all. Every trade was organized into guilds, ZA, which acted as both professional associations and instruments of state control. Paper merchants belonged to such guilds, which set prices, enforced standards, and distributed quotas. Membership was both a privilege and a constraint. Only guild members could legally trade in paper, but they had to follow strict rules: how much to charge, how much to supply, and how to report sales. Records were submitted regularly, often copied in meticulous brushstrokes on official registers. This meant that merchants spent much of their time on bureaucracy rather than bargaining. Each shipment had to be declared. Each sale had to be logged. Guild overseers visited shops to check compliance. Fines were imposed for errors or shortages. The process was dull, repetitive, and sometimes stifling. A merchant might spend more time recording his sales than actually selling paper. Yet he had no choice. To survive in the trade, he had to comply with the paperwork of paper. The guild system also meant collective responsibility. If one merchant failed to meet a quota, others had to make up the difference. If one cheated, the guild as a whole could be punished. This fostered vigilance. Merchants watched one another closely, reported irregularities, and demanded accountability. Meetings were held to discuss supply, prices, and obligations. These gatherings were not festive but bureaucratic, filled with discussions of numbers and rules. The guild was less a brotherhood than a bureaucratic machine. At the same time, guild membership brought security. Merchants were protected from competition outside the guild. They had guaranteed markets, since temples, officials, and schools needed steady supplies of paper. The guild negotiated directly with the shogunate, shielding individual merchants from harsher interference. In this way, the guild acted as both burden and safeguard, a double-edged system that bound merchants into a life of routine. Paper itself was subject to regulation. Official documents required specific grades and sizes. Temples demanded sutra paper of particular thickness. Magistrates insisted on standard sheets for records. Merchants had to memorize these categories and keep them separate. Their ledgers listed not just amounts sold but types: thick mulberry sheets, thin tissue, patterned decorative paper. Mistakes could lead to disputes or penalties. Accuracy was not simply good practice, it was survival. Smuggling and fraud were constant concerns. Some merchants tried to sell paper outside guild channels, avoiding taxes or price controls. Others adulterated their stock, mixing lower quality sheets into bundles. The shogunate responded with inspections. Officials visited shops, unwrapped bundles, and compared them with declared inventories. Merchants lived under the constant possibility of audits. The monotony of paperwork was matched by the anxiety of oversight. Beyond economics, paper merchants were tied to culture. They supplied the booming publishing industry of Edo. Cheap woodblock printed books, known as kiboshi and kusazoshi, required vast amounts of paper. Theater posters, poetry collections, and satirical prints flowed out of shops, all dependent on steady supply. Merchants were thus indirectly connected to the cultural vibrancy of the city. Yet their role remained invisible. Readers remembered authors and artists, not the merchants who sold the sheets on which their work was printed. Merchants also supplied households. Shoji screens, wrapping paper, fans, and umbrellas all required paper. Families bought in small quantities while institutions bought in bulk. Shops often displayed samples of decorative paper with patterns or colors. These goods were popular for gifts and festivals. Yet even in these transactions, bureaucracy intruded. Every sale was recorded, taxes were applied, receipts were stamped with seals. A purchase of a few sheets could generate several lines in a ledger. The rhythm of commerce was inseparable from the rhythm of paperwork. The monotony of this life shaped the merchants themselves. Children grew up in shops surrounded by stacks of paper, hearing the sound of abacuses clicking and brushes scratching. They learned arithmetic early, helping to count bundles. They practiced brushwork, copying figures into ledgers. Their future was predetermined. Sons inherited the trade, bound to the guild, destined to repeat the routines of their fathers. Life was not about ambition but about endurance, about maintaining continuity in a world where change was discouraged. The uneventfulness of their lives was perhaps their greatest contribution. In a society that valued stability, merchants embodied it. Their steady supply ensured that officials had documents, artists had materials, and households had everyday goods. They did not seek fame or power, but their persistence sustained the social and cultural fabric of Edo. What remains of them today? Surviving ledgers in Japanese archives, filled with neat brushstrokes listing deliveries, payments, and sales. Guild records describing quotas and fines. Contracts stamped with seals. These fragments tell us little about personalities, but much about systems. They show that the life of a paper merchant was one of careful record-keeping, steady supply, and quiet obligation. Picture one such merchant at the end of his day. He sits at a low desk, abacus before him, tallying the sales of the day. His wife wraps small bundles of decorative paper for customers. His son copies figures into a ledger, practicing his brush. The shop is dim, lit by an oil lamp. Outside, Edo bustles with laughter, theaters, and noise. Inside, the world is quiet, filled with the sound of counting. It is not a dramatic scene, yet it represents the persistence that held society together. And here lies the unresolved thought. Did the merchants, bound by guild rules and repetitive duties, ever see themselves as more than functionaries? Or did they, like the paper they sold, accept their role as the silent material on which others wrote the story of their age? You have seen how Edo paper merchants managed their trade, obeyed guild rules, and filled endless ledgers. To complete their story, you must consider what their quiet routines meant for the wider life of Japan, and what legacy they left behind once the Tokugawa order ended. The Tokugawa shogunate was built on stability. Samurai upheld order, peasants produced rice, artisans supplied goods, and merchants distributed them. Within this system, paper merchants occupied a small but crucial role. They kept the bureaucracy supplied, the temples equipped, and the culture flourishing. Their work was uneventful, but uneventfulness was the point. A society that feared disruption depended on predictable trades. The dull rhythm of bundles counted and receipts stamped was a form of order as important as laws or armies. The cultural impact of their trade was immense. Without steady paper supply, the flowering of literature and art in Edo Japan would not have been possible. Cheap novels, illustrated booklets, and satirical prints relied on abundant paper. Kabuki theaters needed posters and scripts. Poets needed sheets for copying verses. Merchants quietly sustained this cultural explosion. Yet they received little recognition. Writers and artists became famous, but the merchants remained invisible, their contribution hidden in the background of culture. Even religion depended on them. Temples required sutra copying paper, shrines used paper for rituals, and monks purchased supplies for everyday use. The merchant's ledger, listing deliveries to temples, reveals a hidden connection between bureaucracy and spirituality. What seemed like mere trade was in fact the infrastructure of faith. Their position, however, remained paradoxical. Merchants were ranked at the bottom of the Confucian social hierarchy, below peasants and artisans. They were seen as profit seekers dependent on others' labor. Yet in practice, many became prosperous. Paper merchants did not flaunt wealth, for social norms restricted them, but their comfortable homes and stable incomes show that the lowest class could quietly thrive. Still, their prosperity was never matched by prestige. They accepted invisibility as the cost of stability. When Japan opened to the West in the mid-19th century, paper merchants faced change. Western-style paper mills introduced machine-made sheets that could be produced faster and cheaper. Printing technology also shifted, requiring different grades of paper. Some traditional merchants adapted, incorporating new products. Others clung to old methods, supplying temples and traditional craftsmen. Many guilds dissolved as the Meiji state replaced Tokugawa regulations with modern laws. The bureaucratic world of quotas and guild fines faded, but the habits of record-keeping and steady supply endured. Their legacy lives in two ways. First, in the survival of traditional Japanese paper known as washi. Today, it is prized for its beauty and strength, used in art, conservation, and crafts. This tradition would not have survived without centuries of merchants who kept the trade alive, even in monotonous routines. Second, in the idea of commerce as stability. The careful ledgers and predictable supply of Edo merchants shaped Japanese business culture, where reliability and record-keeping remain core values. What of the merchants themselves? Their names rarely appear in histories. Their voices are silent. What remains are their ledgers, contracts, and guild records. In them, we see the monotony of their days. Bundles listed, payments noted, fines imposed. The handwriting is neat, the numbers steady. It is the handwriting of endurance, not ambition. Picture one last scene. It is the late Tokugawa era, and a merchant sits in his shop. Outside, political change is brewing, foreign ships anchor in Japanese waters, and samurai debate reform. Inside the shop, none of this is visible. The merchant unwraps a bundle of paper, checks it against his ledger, and stamps a receipt. His son copies the figures. His wife prepares a package for a temple order. The world outside may be shifting, but inside, the rhythm is unchanged. The empire of paper continues, quiet and uneventful. This is the lesson of their story. History is not only shaped by great battles or rulers. It is also shaped by men and women whose lives were routines, whose work was boring, but whose persistence sustained societies. The paper merchants of Edo remind us that even the dullest duties can leave enduring marks. Without their ledgers and bundles, there would have been no decrees, no sutras, no books, no prints. Their uneventful lives carried the weight of culture itself. And so the thought lingers. When we measure Japan's history, should we remember only the samurai and shoguns, or should we also honor the merchants who, through endless counting and dull routine, kept the nation's paper flowing and its culture alive?